ISO is a particularly important camera setting, but it's quite often overlooked or misunderstood, especially by beginner photographers. Let me take you back to the days of film, when manufacturers like Kodak and Fuji would print a number on the side of the box. That number was referred to as the ASA, and it indicated the speed of the film, that is, how sensitive the film was to light. The ASA numbers generally tended to start at 100 and then double up to 200 and then 400 and 800 and so on. And very importantly, the lower the number, the better the quality of the negatives and consequently the final prints. The lower numbered films, around 100, 200, were known as slow films. Films higher than that were called fast films. So, some people mistakenly thought that you had to use a fast film for subjects moving fast, like a car or a cyclist, and use a slow film for portraits or something moving very slowly. In fact, it actually referred to the speed at which the film reacted to light and how sensitive the film was to the light. 100 ASA film was originally deemed to be the kind of everyday film that most people would use, and typically you'd use that for outdoor photos, say on holiday for example. 400 ASA and higher tended to be used by maybe sports photographers who needed to be able to freeze the action using a fast shutter speed, or maybe just photographers who wanted to take photos in low light, or maybe inside a church or cathedral for example. The problem was, at least in the early days, the higher the ASA number, the more grainy were the negatives and prints. If you look closely at the prints, they had a kind of textured, sometimes a lumpy kind of look to them, and this was due to the presence of small particles of metallic silver. Who can forget those old grainy black and white photos taken in cafes and bars years ago? Okay, you youngsters out there, if this was before your time, go and look up, say, old black and white photos of the Beatles. You'll see what I mean. And don't ask who were the Beatles. Anyway, as film technology developed, the problem of grain went away to a large extent. And in fact, 400 ASA film is now used in the majority of small disposable cameras that people take on holiday or use at parties or weddings and so on. And then along came digital cameras, and in the digital world the term ASA was replaced by the letters ISO, and grain became known as noise. In the early days of digital cameras, the noise performance at higher ISO levels was relatively poor. You couldn't take a photo higher than say 200 ISO without it looking like a complete mess, due to the presence of so much noise. But now, with the march of technology, compact and bridge cameras can easily go to ISO 800, 1600 even. And SLR and the new mirrorless cameras can easily get clean images at ISO 3200 and 6400, and even higher depending obviously on the camera. The image quality of modern cameras now is absolutely brilliant. It's wonderful to see. Plus, of course, the ISO can be changed on a frame-by-frame basis, whereas in the days of film, you were locked into a particular ASA for the whole roll of the film. But despite the superb high ISO performance of today's modern cameras, it's still best to keep the ISO at its lowest possible setting for any given lighting condition to be assured of the best possible image quality. One little tip is that even though an image may look a little grainy or noisy when you look at it on a large screen and a large size, if you print it, you may well get a very pleasant surprise, as the noise will not be as noticeable on a print. To demonstrate how the ISO works in practice, I'm going to take a few photos of this beautiful graphite guitar here. Unfortunately, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to a good friend of mine. So, to start off with, I'm going to put the camera in manual mode, and I've got the aperture set to, let's see, 5.6, and the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second, and the ISO is 100. Let's see how this looks. As you can see, that's far too dark. You can just about pick out some of the detail of the guitar. What I'll try next is increasing the ISO to 400. Now, because I'm in manual mode, the shutter speed and the aperture will remain exactly as they are. Let's see how this looks. So this is ISO 400. Okay, it's a little bit better. You can see more detail in the guitar, but it's still far too dark. So what we're going to do now is increase the ISO. The other settings will remain the same because we're in manual mode. I think if I went to ISO 800 it will still be too dark. So I'm going to go to ISO 1600. Let's see how this looks now. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. It looks a lot better now. But it's still too dark, isn't it? So let's increase the ISO to 3200. And that looks to be about the correct exposure. Notice that the shutter speed and the aperture didn't change throughout. But as I said, I was shooting in manual mode there, and I know most people will shoot in either aperture priority or shutter speed priority. So let's change to aperture speed priority and go through the same process again. I've set the aperture at f5.6 and the ISO 100, same as it was first time around. But because we're in aperture mode priority, the camera chooses the shutter speed and it's chosen a really slow shutter speed of 1/8 of a second. And because of that, I wasn't able to hold the camera still for that length of time and we got a blurry photo. So I'm going to increase the ISO to 800. Still on aperture f5.6. Right, so I'm now on a 40th of a second, which is a much better shutter speed. Still quite slow though. So I'm going to go to ISO 1600 and that should be a reasonable shutter speed. So I've now got a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second. To get back to where we were before, with the shutter speed of about 160th of a second, I'd need to increase the ISO to 3200. And that's exactly the same settings we were at before, but we arrived at those settings in a completely different way. So to sum up, you can really think of the ISO in manual mode as being a way of lightening or darkening the image. But in aperture priority or shutter speed priority or program mode, which most of you will be using, you can think of the ISO as a way of getting to the aperture or shutter speed that you really want for your subject and the lighting conditions. Bye for now.